We're going to bring in a Belichick expert. That's what we're going to do. We don't usually do guests on Felger and Mazz. Not many guests on the program, but I thought that under the circumstances, this was a good time to do it. I have later come to learn that this particular guest is a fan of the guy sitting next to me, McCarthy, Ted Johnson.
I mean, who wouldn't be?
I think it's a mutual love affair between these two. But Gary Myers, former columnist at the New York Daily News, covered football there for a long time. I think he also worked in Dallas, if I'm not mistaken. And Gary, you're making enemies down there on talk radio in New York, from what I understand. So you might as well come on to Boston radio and talk to some friendly voices here.
I always thought that Boston had the best sports talk radio in the country, so it's an easy transition for me.
You see what he did there? He's taking a shot at the people in New York at the same time. Right, he's feuding with those guys. So for those of you who don't know, Gary has another book out, which we'll get to. We'll plug that at the end of the segment, Gary, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
And but the subject of that book is the '86 New York Giants, when you were obviously there during the Belichick years. So let me start with this. I know you've written some things on Twitter over the last several weeks regarding Bill Belichick, the magnitude of that story. So tell me how you think this is going to play out. Is this Belichick's final year in New England? And if so, where do you think he's going?
Well, Tony, if you had asked me back in July if this was going to be his last year in New England, I'd say there's not a chance in the world that he's going to go break Shula's record anywhere else, that Robert Kraft would want him to do it as the Patriots coach, and Bill would want to do it as the Patriots coach. But there comes an end point for a lot of these coaches. I saw it happen to Landry when I was in Dallas. Don Shula had happened to, and Bill Walsh walked away because he thought things were going, even though they just won a Super Bowl, he thought his time was up with the 49ers. And it just seems clear to me that it would be best for both Belichick and for the Patriots to come to a mutual parting after the season. I just think after all these years, the Patriots need a new voice and they need new direction. And I think that Belichick can use a new audience, and he can use a team that will help him get past Shula with a quarterback in place. And, as I've mentioned to a bunch of people, I really think it's important for Belichick's legacy now, considering what's happened the last 4 years, for him to go and win a Super Bowl without Brady. Because the biggest argument in the 20 years together was it Brady or was it Belichick? And you can argue that point from either side. But the last 4 years, I think, has kind of shifted the narrative in Brady's favor, because in his first year away from Belichick, he went and won a Super Bowl with a team that's had about as much postseason success in the last 10 years as, say, the Jets have, which meant they had none. So he took a downtrodden team and won a Super Bowl with it. And Bill is things have just really deteriorated there. So I think he'll get traded after the season. There's no way a businessman like Kraft is just going to let Belichick leave. He's not going to fire him. He's not going to make him go through the indignity of that. And I think, as I've said all along, I think the Chargers are clearly the number one possibility, and my dark horse candidate is the Cowboys after they lose in the divisional round to the playoffs again this year.
Well, that would be fun, and I would agree with you, Gary. And it's good to talk to you, Gary. It's Ted. It's it was when Tony said you were coming on. I was thrilled to hear that. But that would be something else for him to go maybe coach for the Dallas Cowboys. But I'm curious. You mentioned legacy, and a lot of people, Gary, thought that his legacy was cemented. Like when Tom Brady left, it didn't matter what Tom did when he left. It didn't matter really what Bill did after, what he did here after Tom left. It was cemented. But I disagreed. It sounds like you disagreed. It sounds like maybe you think Bill is that's something that drives Bill, is his legacy and changing that narrative that he's only a great coach because of Tom Brady. Is that what you're saying? You think that Bill, that's a huge motivating factor in him still maybe wanting to coach?
Absolutely, Teddy. I mean, just look at it. He was 37-45 in 5 years in Cleveland. He was 5-13 with Bledsoe when Drew got hurt, unfortunately, and suffered that really serious injury. And then his career took off with Brady. Now, I thought at the beginning, and people in New England probably agree with this. I mean, Tom was unknown, and Belichick played around him with a great defense and was able to run the ball, and they won that Super Bowl. I thought that first one was all Belichick, and then by numbers 2 and 3 in 2003 and 4, we started to see a shift that, hey, this guy Brady's pretty good. And, the Patriots really had 2 dynasties, the first 10 years and the last 10 years, each with 3 championships. And I certainly think the second 10 years belonged to Brady. And then their time away from each other just kind of reinforced, the role I think that Brady had in sustaining the success in New England. Because he went and took a Tampa team that, had good talent, and Tom took him over the top, and things have just, gotten worse rather than better through the Mac Jones years, where you thought that as he got acclimated, that he would, have a lot of success. I think Belichick's most curious coaching move ever is what he did last year, having Matt Patricia, defensive coach, and Joe Judge, a special teams coach, both of them failed head coaches, be the quarterback and offensive coordinator, maybe didn't have the titles, but for Mac Jones. And I think that to this point, I'd have to say that has destroyed his career. And who knows what's going to happen going forward. But I didn't really understand what Bill did last year. And but, when you talk about what could be next, I mean, I have no idea what the Patriots would do, whether it would be Mayo or, just go out and find the best coach outside the organization. But with Belichick, you also have to wonder, has what's happened the last 4 years turned teams off to wanting to bring him in? And they're saying, well, this guy won with the greatest quarterback in NFL history. Can he win with anybody else? And that's why I think, now I'm not putting John Herbert in any kind of category, as he is potentially an elite quarterback with the right coaching, which he has not gotten with the Chargers. They have a decent enough defense. He's a really, really good player. He reminds me so much of Marino. And the other thing to consider there is, even though Spanos has not been known to spend money on coaches, the Chargers are clearly the number 2 team in that town, and they need to make an impact in that market. They're so overshadowed by the Rams. They're playing in the Rams stadium. They can't win close games. They're wasting the talents of one of the best young quarterbacks in the league. I think it's a ready-made situation for Belichick to go and win a Super Bowl in one of the, maybe he'll coach there 2 years, and I think that gives an opportunity to win a Super Bowl there, and kind of get back on an even playing field with Brady in terms of who is responsible for what in New England.
So, Gary, that's what I wanted to ask you about next, okay, is the fit. And first of all, the whole thing with Patricia and Judge has mystified everybody. It was one of the most clueless things I've ever seen. And to come from a guy like him makes no sense at all. And frankly, I thought that was a fireable offense in and of itself, Gary. Mm-hmm. Okay, like they could have done it at the end of last year and nobody would have complained. But there's been some debate here, about the kind of scenario that Belichick would like in his next job. Some have theorized, for example, he'd want to go to a place where he could build the whole thing from the ground up, because that's what Belichick is on some level, that he's a builder. But at this stage, obviously, he's going to be 72 years old next season, and the record is within striking distance of what have you. You seem to think he will want to coach at a place where he can go and win immediately.
No question, Tony. I mean, why at this age and being as close to the record as he is he's going to want to go to a place that he's got to start from scratch. It doesn't make any sense. I will tell you of a conversation I had with Bill. I sat next to him for 8 hours at the Hall of Fame Centennial Committee meeting in Canton in 2020. Now, keep in mind, this was either 2 or 3 days after Patriots had lost to the Titans in what turned out to be Brady's last game in New England. And so these 8.5-hour meetings have about 4 hours of dead time. And so Bill and I hadn't spoken in about 15 years because I tattooed him pretty good during the Spygate stuff. And he deserved it, and I had some fun with it. And as a result, we never had a really warm relationship in the years that I knew him in New York, but we were cordial enough, but I can sense how upset he was with me. So the funny part of the story is we're sitting at a horseshoe table, and I put my stuff down at an empty seat next to this a guy from the Associated Press who I was friendly with. And on the other side is an empty seat with a notebook. And John Zarneski, who worked for Fox for a long time, says to me, Bill's sitting there. Now, he wasn't aware of any relationship I had with Belichick, and I thought he was talking about Bill Polian. So I go, oh, Polian, that's great. I get along great with him. And he goes, no, it's Belichick. And I go, oh, what's going to happen here? Am I going to be sitting next to somebody for 8 hours that's not going to talk to me? And so he goes and sits down, and, I put up I shake his hand. I said, good to see you. We had the best time. I'm not being dramatic here or saying this to drop names or anything like that, because that's not me. But we just had a really nice time sitting next to each other. So at one point, and this is a long way of answering your question about whether he'd go to a rebuild, I said to him, I had written a column the year before that perhaps this is the time to come back to the Giants. I think it was right after Seth Wickersham had written that long piece on ESPN about some of the friction in the organization. And I said, would you ever consider that? And he said to me, I can't go to a place where I got to rebuild the entire front office. I can't do that at this point in my life. And so I think you can probably apply that to what his thought process would be on whatever his next step is. That's why, forget about Carolina, forget about Washington. He's not going to these places that's going to take him 3 or 4 years to pass Shula. What's he need, another 16, I think?
16 to break.
Where he's got to do it in 2 years. And if he's having success, maybe he stays longer. But I think when he's evaluating situations, he's going to look, where can I win 16 games in a 2-year period? And in that 2-year period, have a really good chance to win the Super Bowl. And the reason I mentioned Dallas, and that was actually the first team I mentioned before I kind of jumped on the Chargers possibility, is I know he has a good relationship with Jerry Jones. I know that Belichick's friendship with Parcells is better now than it ever has been, and I brought that out in my book, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I know Parcells, despite what people might think, loved working with Jerry Jones, much more so than he enjoyed working with Robert Kraft, although I think he regrets how
the way it ended, right?
Yeah.
So
I think if Bill would have – he built that team, and then Belichick got the quarterback. But I think Bill would highly recommend to Belichick – Parcells would recommend to Belichick, if the situation presents itself, go work in Dallas. And I just don't – Jerry Jones is in the early 80s. It's been since 1995 that they even made it as far as an NFC championship game, and that's last year they won the Super Bowl. He needs to win, and he needs to win soon. And this is McCarthy's fourth year, and he hasn't been past a divisional round, and most likely he's going to have to win 1, if not 2, playoff games on the road to get to a Super Bowl, and I don't see that happening.
Okay, so Gary, I want to get to the book, but let me ask you quickly, just because I want to add another team into that scenario. You mentioned the Chargers, you mentioned the Cowboys. What about Buffalo? Is that a fit?
I think that would be a fit if they make a change there. Okay. I just don't think they're going to make a change there.
Okay, I just wonder, with all the stuff swirling around McDermott now, the way. The story came out recently about the allusion he made to 9/11 in a meeting with the team.
Oh, horrible.
Oh, yeah. And then on top of it, obviously they've underachieved. So I just wonder whether they're also a candidate. Tell us about the book.
I would think that's a good thought if they make a change there, that would be a possibility for Belichick. As far as the book, and I appreciate you letting me talk about it for a second. It's called Once a Giant, A Story of Victory, Tragedy, and Life After Football. And it's about the 86 Giants Super Bowl team, but it's really more about life after football. And what players from that generation have experienced, the challenges, physically, the mental health issues caused by concussions and the concerns about CTE and the financial issues because the health insurance is so inadequate for former players. So I really have some eye-opening, compelling stories. There's 4 players on the record who have admitted to me or told the story how they seriously contemplated suicide as a result of some of their issues from football. But rather than making it 300 pages of depressing stories, I really balanced it off with how this team became a real brotherhood. And I know that's kind of an overused expression, but 37 years later, these guys still take care of each other. They take each other to doctor's appointments. Parcells has loaned out $4 million without any expectation of being repaid to about 20 players who have been in need. Now, that's $4 million total, not $4 million to each player. But
Right.
I've never heard of anything like that before, and he feels an obligation because he puts them through 2-day practices, 3-4 days a week during training camp. We're in a physical practice during the week during the season, and he knows a lot of what he put them through has resulted in some of the problems that they are going through now, and he feels an obligation and responsibility to help them out as much as he can. And I think it's put Bill in a different light as far as people's perspective of him, that he's also in his early 80s. He's become a grandfatherly figure, maybe a fatherly figure to a lot of his former players who call him on his birthday, who send him cards on Father's Day. It's really like the heartwarming story of a book that otherwise has a lot of heartbreaking stories in it.
Okay, and I don't need to tell you, for lots of reasons, there are a lot of connections to the Giants in this area, not the least of which, by the way, are Parcells and Belichick. So,
Yes.
I don't need to tell you that. Once a Giant, I'm assuming Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, all the usual places?
All the places people like to get their books. And if I can just throw a baseball reference in here, and it's been one of the great compliments been paid to me about this book, is that people have told me it's the football version of Boys of Summer.
Yep.
Which is a book that I loved and one of the best sports books of all time. I would never make that comparison myself, but I'm proud that people have. And again, you don't have to be a Giant fan to want to read this book. You have to be interested in the human interest stories of players from that generation who played in an era, and Teddy knows this, that when you suffer concussion, they take you to the sidelines and they say, what's your name, what stadium you're in, and what team you're playing for. And if you answered yes, okay, back in the game, you go back in the game. If that happens now, you don't see that guy for another 3 weeks. And, dinged up, it was the operative term, and we know it was much more than that.
Yep, different era, Gary. Different era, absolutely. Listen, thank you for the time. Best of luck with the book. We appreciate the insight.
Thanks, Gary.
Take care, guys. Happy holidays to you guys and all your listeners. And, Boston has the best radio shows in the country. I'm saying that especially now after some of the ridiculousness that's gone on in New York lately.
Yeah, we're not going to fight you on that one, Gary. Thank you.
Man.
So, again, Gary Myers, formerly of the Daily News, also the Dallas Morning News, I believe, joining us via the Volkswagen Dealers Expert Hotline. Don't go anywhere. Your call's next.